May the force be with you is a phrase used to wish a person well to overcome a challenge. The invitation in this podcast, May the life force be with you, is to explore what it means to truly feel alive, to appreciate the physical, emotional and spiritual connection to our energy, and finally to understand how this impacts who you are and all that you do. May this conversation inspire you to thrive. This episode of May the Life Force Be With You is brought to you by Moment Company and the Moment Pebble. The Moment Pebble is a beautiful, natural stone, light-guided breathing device and is a unique gift for someone who needs that gentle reminder to stop and take a break, to take moments throughout their busy day and to practice mindfulness. Just head over to momentcompany.co, that's momentcompany.co, and enter the code LIFEFORCE at checkout to receive an exclusive 10% podcast discount. Hello and welcome everybody to the latest episode of May the Life Force Be With You. And Karila and I have a fabulous guest, Elaine, with us today, who Karila is going to introduce in just a second. But before we do, I almost feel like I've got to do a little bit of prep for the next hour because it feels like it's going to be a great conversation. I can feel the energy building already. So I just welcome, Elaine, you to our space and to our podcast. Thank you for being here. And I invite everybody else who's listening to grab a cuppa, sit down, take a deep breath, whenever it feels right, just for you to kind of get into our energy, our space and our zone today. And we welcome whatever comes up in this conversation, from death and aliveness, which I know are some of the things you've talked about in the past, to pleasure, to breathwork, to sexuality, and to everything that connects all of that to life force. So Karila, over to you.
I am so honoured and excited to be introducing Elaine Yonge to this conversation. She's a facilitator, an energy and body worker. She works in the realms of spirituality, breathwork, shamanism, energy, pleasure, spirituality and soul. And why I am so excited to welcome her to this conversation is every time I am lucky enough to have a moment of connection with her, it's mind-blowing and it's liberating and it's inspiring. But also over the years, Elaine's taught all over the world. She's held space all over the world. And over the years of knowing her, I've bumped into people who know her too, who have been held by her. And I have never ever known of a space holder that has as much respect when people talk about her as Elaine. And yeah, I've never known it with any other amazing space holders I know. The level of respect that people have for this amazing woman is like next level. And that really says something about her work and who she is and her heart. And so I am just so excited. She's on May the Life Force Be With You. And so Elaine, thank you. It's funny because just before we went live, just before you came on, me and Fiona were like, let's get her to talk about pleasure. Then you came on and you were like, yeah, I'm really excited not to be talking about pleasure. But then you said something really interesting, and you said, actually, pleasure creates life force energy. And that was the thing that made me go, that's where I want to begin this conversation. So, yeah.
Hello. Wow. Thank you. It's so nice to meet you, Fiona. And also, as Claire said, we've had a long history now of years of, abstract conversations and moments and places. And I mean, firstly, with a name like May the Life Force Be With You, how could I not want to come on? Like that in itself was just like such a great title.
Thank Fiona for that title. Yeah. She is a genius. Came up with it.
For all the anti-woo-woo parts of me, and so it's interesting because earlier this year I had to write an introduction for a course that I was doing that was on energy. And And I remember thinking, I need to write something about energy to give people an idea of what I'm talking about, because it is such a multi-modality word, So what do we even mean? And I once spent 7 days in a space where the facilitator banned us from using the word energy at all, ever.
Wow.
And it was a very interesting experience to see, like, what am I actually talking about? Am I talking about sensation? Am I talking about a feeling? Am I talking about an emotion? Am I talking about something else? So I have this interesting relationship with the word energy, and particularly the word energy and life force and chi, and how that is used, throughout many different traditions and practices, whereby in some traditions people speak of chi and life force being different channels, being separate, or where does chi sit with life force and sexual energy?
If somebody's like, I don't know what you're talking about, what would you say? I mean, I think anybody listening to this is already curious about life force energy. But if somebody's going, okay, you're talking about chi, and I've never heard of this, what would you say chi is?
Well, like almost everything, if you Googled it, you'd probably get 1,000 definitions of what it is. When I'm using it, I'm meaning chi when it's spoken about in traditional practices like Taoist practices and Qigong, where we're talking about they equate it to life force energy too. And those energy channels are channels that are inside of us, sometimes through chakra system, which some people may know, or the meridians. And they're also in the energy field outside of our body, because there's an auric field or energy that expands. So in traditions, particularly more of the older Eastern traditions, they tend to refer to chi. Some people use life force. Many people that I work with in sexuality, when they say life force, they mean sexual energy. And other people see that as being a separate flow. So for me...
Which one do you believe?
For me, I experience them all as being the core energy, which is the sexual energy. Is not only the sexual energy, but the sexual energy is in there. I feel, for me, in the core of life force.
For me too. I feel like sexual energy. I feel like it's a shame that we are so narrow with our sexual energy, because I feel like it stops us connecting to our life force energy, because we kind of put it over there in that box of like, that's the only time I can connect to it is when I'm with a partner, or do you see what I mean? Yeah. Like, I'm sure part of the work that you do is about bridging that and changing that.
Completely. I mean, it'd be a whole other podcast on why are we disconnected from our sexual energy, and why are we afraid and ashamed, and why do we lock it in a box and only take it out when it's appropriate, whatever that appropriate time may be. And, also when I was preparing this piece of writing, I had to name the fact that, in my view, and this will not resonate with everyone, societal structures and religious structures and cultural structures have been working to disconnect us from the force of our sexual energy. And if we want to be conspiracy theorists about it, we would say it's so that we're disconnected from our power, because for me, the connection to sexual energy is intrinsically linked with the personal power, with the aliveness we have. But it's not just all about sexual energy, where I've seen the other end of the scale, where people who are deeply focused on sexuality, they kind of miss the wider spectrum of all the other energies, and they're just focusing in on sexual energy itself.
It's interesting you said that, because that is where my mind went. It's almost like there's two extremes right now in culture and society. Grew up in Scotland like you, Elaine, and there's just don't talk about that stuff, heaven forbid. You just wouldn't talk about that. So you've kind of got the repress, keep it quiet, don't give it away. That's your precious thing that you keep that for yourself, versus the opposite end, maybe in the last 20, 30 years, probably 40 years, where it's like maybe 50, put it out there. But it's very much a badge that isn't connected. And when you see obviously particularly women in media, it feels like everything's on show, but it feels very shallow. And it feels like there is no connection to self. It's a display rather than it being an actual symbol of power or connection. So I can kind of see that both sides.
Completely. And on top of my Scottish reservedness, my mother's family are from Ireland and are Catholics. So I had like this
perfect mix.
Double dose of Scottish and Irish sexual shame that, came through the generations. And it is, I see often when I work with people in groups about sexuality, I say that it's either shamed and shut down or it's objectified. So it's kind of like they don't want us to be connected to our sexual energy because of all the reasons that it's shameful and it's sinful and it's dangerous and blah, blah, blah. And they want to use sexual energy to sell us stuff, to make us feel like we need to buy expensive handbags or sports cars. So there's like these, and also the same is true with pornography, where there's a lot of disconnection and a lot of impersonalization and disconnection from the heart. And there's this kind of, and actually another big subject obviously in the world today, connected a lot to life force, is trauma. And actually a lot of, hypersexuality and expression of sexuality is actually now being more recognized as a trauma response in itself. So we either really can shut down or we can really become overtly, overly, outwardly sexual, but actually it's often related to trauma responses for basic things like safety and approval and validation and all of that. So yeah, this almost like an overcompensation after sexual repression for generations, there's like a bit of the claiming of sexual freedom and also it can then swing almost like too far the other way, where it becomes the focus, the obsession. It becomes, some people that I've worked with in the past would come with a message of in an email saying that they had addictions, or dysfunctional behavior. So there's everything in the spectrum from complete fear and shut down to over focus, distorted sexuality, and what I'm interested in is where can we start to come into an integrated, form of this, where we're neither in shutdown and denial or being run by our sexual energy and it taking over all of our decisions and all of our choices in life.
So I'm really curious about what you said about shame. Because, I'm curious about two things you've just said. Because you said, sexual energy is power, and I'd really like to go into what power means when you say that, and because I think we have a really uncomfortable relationship with power. And the reason why I'm then so interested when you're kind of talking about different forms of shame and how they manifest in sexual energy and in our relationship with sexual energy. Part of the reason I'm interested in that is because from my shadow work understanding, shame is the feeling of being overpowered. So shame is the feeling of not having our power. And I'm just curious as to how an experience of being overpowered then displaces your relationship with your life force energy, also known as your sexual energy, also known as your power, and how when somebody is feeling overpowered or feeling shame, they can then, like, where do you go from there? Like, how do you reclaim?
Yeah, well, power is an interesting word in itself, and in many of the processes I've worked with over the years with people, power has been one of the main areas of exploration, because a lot of people have lost their power, given away their power, had it taken away from them in some ways at some times. Mm-hmm. And so when we use the word power, most often what people think is the unhealthy, dynamic that is mostly out in the world, which is power used in a way to dominate others, to have control. So when I say the word power, what I'm meaning is a personal power, which is very different to that kind of power that is dominant and used to gain things. It's like this personal inner power. So in terms of...
You know the root meaning of the word power?
Tell me. I'm sure there's quite a few, but what
The root meaning of the word power is the same as the root meaning of the word magic, and it means to be able.
Amazing. Yeah, so it's that...
There's nothing to do with exerting power over somebody else. It is exactly what you just said it is. It's that, like, to have the... to be capable.
Yeah.
To be capable of presumably what you want.
As soon as you say power in a room to a group of people that we're going to be working with power, like there's this collective freezing of breath and tension, and there's this fear and desire for it because there's a lot misunderstood, and there's actually people who don't want power because they see it's being it's dangerous and it gets misused, and they see other people, so some people, they give away all their power because they feel like I don't want to behave badly with that power, as they perceive it, or I don't want responsibility for that power. So it's actually, in some ways, it's kind of...
And do you think that's the over-sexualization? Do you think that's giving away power when people go into that over-sexualization? It's like, I'm getting this power and I need to just give it away.
It can be. I think it's more commonly it's like a hypersexual trauma response that either comes from being valued for that, gaining validation for that, perhaps having experiences, particularly in early life, which then lead you to that default way of fawning and people pleasing, which can be displayed just in your general behavior, but can also really be displayed very strongly in a very hypersexual way. And it can be a way of trying to get power from the outside. So often that can lead to this kind of, trading with sex and power. And sex, power, and money are the three of the biggest anchors of things that human beings are trying to work through, I think, in this time on the planet. So personal power...
Because they're all energy.
Yeah, because they're all energy.
Because
exactly.
They're all energy.
Yeah. And to some extent, we need them all. To some extent, we're afraid of them all. We want them all. We don't know what to do with them once we get them. So some people with their power, actually, when you delve into it, they actually don't want it because they have a fear that then they're responsible for what they do with it. And in some ways, in this kind of the triangles of people sometimes getting into the victimhood, if I have no power, then, I'm not to blame, I'm not responsible. So can be a fear of like owning that power. And I'm talking here personal power, am I capable? And when we look at the body and people in the energy systems of the chakras, which are these energy centers, so common the wounding in people is in the solar plexus, which is the area of this personal power, of this I am capable, like where am I rooted to? Because many of us have been, attacked there or affected there by life experience. So power, as we were pedaling back to your question about power is this knowing of the self, this kind of self level of belief of I am capable, I have the power to do things, I have the power to influence my own life, to make choices, to be a creator, to love. And if that is not there, then it becomes very challenging as a human being to exist in the world of love, relationships, professional life, financial security, all of those things are affected if we don't. So in terms of how power relates to sexuality, that's one of the areas where we can either be in our power or not be in our power. And so if we're not, then we may, as you say, also be giving away our body or our sexuality in order to try and get power from somewhere else on the outside. And that's
it's so funny you say sex, money and power. It's interesting to me you say sex, money and power, because all of them are about being able. Like power in its raw form is about being able to heat your house, being able to survive the winter. Money opens doors. It's about being able, and sex is creation, for one. It's like being able to keep going, as a human species.
And they're all, as you say, a form of energy, so it's like, the energy of abundance, the energy of, sexual energy, the energy of having personal power, and knowing how to use that and not how to misuse it. And often we're not taught that, just like we're not taught as kids, like, oh wow, you're this amazing human being that's also a spirit and also a sexual being, and also you're a powerful being. Like nobody tells us that. So where do we? So we form most of our ideas based on the outer display, which is often at the extreme ends of distortion, of how those all.
I'd like to ask you about people pleasing, actually, because people pleasing. So what started this podcast was my guides channeled 6 ways that people cause tiredness within themselves, which my guides say is the death of their own life force energy. And their version of people pleasing is that when you people please, what you do is you put your life force energy, which is your sexual energy from their point of view, into somebody else's shadow. And in somebody else's shadow, that energy dies. And so you feel tired. But what also happens with the pattern of people pleasing is you then energize their shadow. So people in an unhealthy relationship, for example, their life force energy is going into somebody's shadow and it's actually making their shadow worse. And so that's why you see that person in the unhealthy relationship shrinking and the other person becoming more and more of a personal nightmare to that person. You also inherit, because your sexual energy is magnetic, you also inherit that person's shadow. So that's why you see somebody getting with an alcoholic and then becoming an alcoholic if they're running this pattern. And because you brought up people pleasing sexually, I just wanted to suggest this view to you about people pleasing and see if you have anything to say from what happens when you then do that sexually. Yeah,
I mean, I've spent a lot of time working with individuals and groups, speaking with people about, their sexual behaviors and engagements and the consequences of those and the patterns of those, which usually are, often strong and often repetitive, based on these kind of inherent behaviors. So firstly, I would say that for me, that kind of makes sense as a way of explaining it, because essentially if you are people pleasing or fawning or engaging sexually with someone not because you really want to, but because there's something to gain, whether that's safety, approval, money, power, whatever it is, you essentially have to have, on some level, a lack of authentic boundaries. So you're allowing yourself to overstep your boundaries. And when you're overstepping your boundaries, you're of course going to be losing energy because you're not in your authentic expression. And they will in return be receiving energy, power, whatever that is, because you're giving it away to them. in some way. You think you're getting something back, and maybe you are getting something back on the side. But actually, for me, the most common kind of fawning things are either people desperately wanting love and attention, and therefore being in sexual engagement because that's the only way they know how to get it. People learning that's the way they can...
Using sex for love, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Or safety. This is really interesting when you look at this trauma element of hypersexuality, where people will often go and connect with the person perceived with the most power. This is why alpha males often in certain constellations, people will engage with them, particularly if the history is of maybe having some violation of their sexual boundaries. They will go and connect with that alpha male in order to get perceived safety. Now it will have other consequences, and often there's a kind of a shadowy trade going on there on both sides. Or they've learned that that's how they get affirmation and validation. And we all do this, to some degree. There's none of us that are free of this. We might do it to a little degree. We might do it in certain circumstances. We might do it at some times and not at others. And we might have the extreme. So where is, this is a beautiful inquiry for me. Where is the part of us that's learning to be a person and to be considerate of others and to be flexible and compatible, and where is the part of us that is actually in some kind of, trading, manipulating, fawning, pleasing, and those lines are often blurred. But there was something else you said that made me, So one of my very simple little visuals that I often say to people when we're talking about energy, particularly sexual energy, but can use for any kind, particularly if you're not in touch with your own sexual energy, you're not able to raise eros in your own body with self-pleasuring or self-love or whatever, is you're kind of walking around like a little particle with a lot of electrons on the outside, like a lot of little negative, things needing charge. And so you're going around kind of looking for someone who's a bit of a proton, who has some positive energy to give to you, to create some kind of, exchange codependency. And often if people are sensitive and aware, they'll sense that you're coming with all these negative things and they'll run the other way, But if there's someone who in that moment feels like there's a trade to be had on their side, they may come and say, okay, yeah, I will take all your negative this, you can have all my positive this, and somehow we'll be in an enmeshment of some kind, which will most likely be subconscious. And so
I guess that's why they call it chemistry.
Their own eros and can move that energy for themselves, then they tend to have more positive, energy on the outside. And ideally, we'd go along with our positive energy and meet another little proton, and we could be in sharing. But so often there's these kind of slightly, dysfunctional kind of connections that we have as a means of survival or as a means of success. So
with the means of survival, is it because literally people, if they're missing? Is it because they're thirsty energetically? Like, is that kind of as simple a way to say it? It's like, if you're thirsty, you're going to drink dirty water. Yeah,
I mean, they're thirsty, but also they are depleted. They're depleted and so they need things to fill them up. So the other thing that when I used to start working with clients, I used to ask them to write a list, and I say this to most people in groups: write a list of all the ways you fill yourself up energetically, and write a list of all the ways you expend energy. Because if you were a car, you wouldn't expect to run with no petrol. But somehow as a human being, we expect to run on an empty tank. And so most people, when they look at this, at like the list of things they're expending energy on, work, supporting others, and where am I filling up my own energy, and And do I even know how to do that? You know, and for some people that might be nature, for some it's food, for some it's exercise, for some it's singing, for whatever your way is. If you don't know how to fill your battery, how to sense when it needs filling, how to fill it up, then you're always going to have to go somewhere, to something or someone outside of yourself. Yeah.
So I'm filling up with energy here because I'm just I want to kind of backtrack if I can about 10 steps, but I'll try.
I can see you, but I can't hear you. And I really want to hear what you're saying.
Oh, we've never had these technical problems before.
Never. Something is happening in the force.
The force is like.
Can you hear me, Karila?
Yeah, I can hear you.
And Elaine, you can't hear me at all.
Can you hear her?
I can hear you, which is strange.
Tell me your questions, Fiona.
Okay. So my question or my observation is that that power is knowing of thyself kind of thing. I felt very powerful in that. So power is you. And so I want to go right back to the very start, Karila, which was when you said that Elaine was an amazing space holder. Mm. Because what does that mean for people that don't know what being a space holder is and how that translates to holding energy for both the self and the collective? And then what's the difference?
Just so I remember. We've never had this happen before, but we'll go for it. So translating Fiona to Elaine. Fiona, she is so interested in and please correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, in this idea that power is thyself, that power is authentic self, that power is you. And then she wants to like rewind right back to what I said at the beginning, which is that you're an amazing space holder and a revered space holder. And she wanted to know what space holding means for anybody that doesn't know what it means and what it means in terms of energy. And how energy and life force are part of space holding. And then I'd like to just add in.
Can I add though, Karila, just the difference between self and collective?
Oh, and what's the difference between self and collective in terms of that?
That's space holding.
And then I'm like, and how did you end up in space holding for people's sexual energy? And so there you go.
So the term space holder is a funny one. And it's like, you know, this sort of language, people, once they know language, just use it and presume everyone knows it. And actually my background, which was many years in as a medical scientist, I used to hate the kind of scientific language that stop people understanding things. So thank you for asking that question. Essentially, it means someone who creates a space for other people to have processes or other people to go through experiences. One of my dear friends and colleagues, who's a real radical being, always says, there's no such thing as space holding. You don't have to hold space. It can hold itself, you know. How arrogant do we think we are that we can hold space? So, you know, there's a part of me that likes to use that term because it actually, people know what you're kind of talking about if they know that language. And also, you know, there is also true, I don't totally agree with her, there is something where those of us who are really the witness and maybe the guide for whatever experience people are in, we are doing something with our presence. And actually what is going on is way beyond that. Because, and this is one of the things that people often, I get asked questions about, and sometimes it's hard to explain in words what is actually happening. But when people sense the energetic of a space that is being held for a certain process, particularly if it's a challenging one around deep emotions or grief or for sexual energy or pain in the body, yes, you can show up in a room as a human being and say, okay, I'm here and this is what we're going to do. But actually, energetically, what needs to happen is a whole lot more than that in the kind of unseen realms of, and when people ask me to describe, well, what did you do to create this space? Because they can feel it. I sometimes find it hard to describe, but for me, it's like grounding the group and the experience into the land, into the space. It's connecting with the parts of me and the supports that I have to bring that there. It's encouraging them to stay connected to their body, to be grounded in themselves, to be, if they can, at least to begin with, to be regulated in their nervous systems and to feel safer. I mean, there's no such thing as safe. And in terms of, I also work with a lot of kind of shamanic principles. So in terms of that, then I'm inviting them to create an energy field. I'm doing that myself. I'm working with the parts of nature that are around us, particularly like bodies of water, which are very good for helping to clear and transmute and support these kind of processes. So it's not just getting a room, opening it up and inviting people into something. And they could both look the same, but people will feel the difference. And often the capacity that people have to drop into their process is affected by those factors. So that does that kind of cover that space holding piece?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
He says it does.
I can see the yes, and I can lip read it does.
I know. Well, I'll just, because it is recording, so...
And your question around, because, well, because you know me, so for years I was working in diagnostics in vascular surgery for a long time with people who were very, very sick in the physical body. And for me, I believe that is related to and a consequence of emotional life, stress, all of those things. And also we are biological creatures that just have things that go wrong. So sometimes things just go wrong. We're human beings with cells that sometimes get messed up. And the effect of the emotions and stress and disconnection from our life force is a big influencing factor on disease. But actually, it was a very powerful grief event in my own life, which then took me to explore grief, emotions, and it was through that journey. And I somehow ended up. I didn't really even know what Tantra was, but I somehow found myself in a weekend. And then I discovered like Osho and a lot of the kind of more dynamic, emotional, cathartic type meditations. And that was one, and I thought I was doing that for myself. I had no intention. I had a nice life. I was kind of settled. I was like, probably like, just like almost 40 or just 40 years old. Why would I change my life at that point? And then it became very clear to me. People were telling me before I knew it, like, you're going to be doing this work. And I was like, no. I have a nice life. I work 3 to 4 days a week. I go on holiday a lot. And then very soon it became clear, like, yes, no, this is what I'm meant to be doing. So it was very much that grief event which shaped me and then shaped the truth. But I see and I understand that what I was doing before for a long time was also part of that and still really serves. And
how was it? How has it served?
On a few levels, I had to speak a lot. I worked although as a scientist, I worked clinically with patients. So I was constantly seeing people in their fear and in their anxiety and speaking with them during examinations and at times about their results. So on that level, I learned a lot about human beings and how they are under stress and in fear and in sickness. And ironically, I was working with many technologies, but mainly ultrasound, where I was using sound waves to look inside the body and to look for blockages and flow, and then I ended up more working now with energy and my hands and people to start with, rather than the machines, and looking for disruption to flow or shutdown to flow, more in the energy system than in the physical body. So I feel like I was working with wavelength and tissue and vibration, and I got to feel a lot. And you know, some of those people I work with were very sick, some of them, you know, in intensive care, many of them on cancer journeys, many of them on other intense journeys. And some days I worked in operating theaters, and we were kind of like inside the body, and so like my connection to the matter, and how that feels, and how I can sense like the history of us, not even just the history of us, like the history of our ancestors and our culture and all the things that end up being held in this body.
It's interesting. Wavelength. What did you say? Wavelength, tissue, and vibration. Like, I can see that that's tantra. I know the meaning of tantra is many things, but like I'm like there's something very tantric about that. So I can definitely see how we are always walking our path, and how you are always walking that path of wavelength, tissue, and vibration, which I love as a statement.
Yeah. Yeah, so when people say, wow, that's very different, I'm like, yes and no, you know, it's actually not so different. And the other element of energy, or that I'm work a lot with, and I'm intrigued by and have always been, is like the part of us that is like not the human being, the part of us that is the essence, the spirit, the soul. And that's another element of energy, which then comes into, I believe, you know, into the energy systems that we have as a human being. And many people are disconnected from that, or don't know how to harness that, or a lot of the wounds or the pain in that part of ourselves can be affecting the human life. A lot of fracture happens between what I perceive to be the soul, and some people may not resonate with that comes into the body, and the dance of working with humans, the way I have been doing these last years is often looking at what is the interrelationship between this essence, this soul, and this human. And where is there a dysfunctional relationship there? Where is there abandonment there? Where is there resentment there? And as you know, I've been quite strongly affected by suicide being in people close to me in my life. And I really see that as one of these things where there's this existential, crisis of between the soul and the human being, and in many of those cases. So that is another element of our life force that is there in this part of us that's kind of not the matter.
That's a really interesting perspective, that life force disconnection between body and soul coming together in that kind of suicide experience for many. You'll probably have to translate that, Karila, but that just is an interesting reflection to me that made a lot of sense. Powerful way to look at it. I'm scared to use the word power now, but yeah.
Don't be scared to use the word power.
You can add your reflection.
Fiona is saying that sorry, I want you to repeat it just because I don't want to misphrase.
It's just a reflection on the observation about suicide being that disconnect between body and soul.
So let me just
that soul distress.
Because if it goes too far, I won't say it. So Fiona is saying that it's an interesting reflection that suicide is the disconnect between body and soul. And do you have a question from that, Fiona? Or is there anything that you want to speak more about in terms of that? Because lots of people are touched by suicide.
Yeah.
And I'm sure anybody that is listening to this that has been touched by suicide is going to go, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Tell me.
So firstly to say, it's obviously not in every case, of course. But in certain cases, and certainly in the cases that I've known of people close to me who have taken their own life, and I know it's like a very, very difficult, painful, confusing thing to experience, and that sends often us into a whole process around our own mortality and our own choices. So when I speak about it, I don't want to make in any way, just go by it, but I don't often, might not always bring it up in a conversation, but I trust that it kind of somehow came up now. So in some instances of people that I've known and been close to who've chosen that choice, and people I know who've had a lot of those kind of thoughts that I've worked with and supported through their processes, there can often be a purpose or a wound or a something that's in this part of us, if we relate to the fact that we have a soul, that is sometimes not fully landed and committed here into the body. Kind of maybe wants to be here, maybe not ready to be here, or maybe not ready to be here in the manifestation of the body it's in, or that wants to drive the life of someone in one particular direction. And many people, in sort of spiritual realms often speak around like the core human wound being the abandonment wound. And, we see this playing out a lot in adults and in our relating. And, one step of that is being separated from the mother at birth, and another step of that taking back might be coming from source or wherever we feel we come from, and being separated and coming into the human body. So sometimes this part of us does not sit well in this human world, doesn't maybe feel heard, or in fact the other time can be that the human personality is disregarded because people are on their soul's path, and the poor human body and the person that just wants to be loved and feel secure is actually being dictated to. So there's this interrelationship where there can be disharmony, there can be disconnection, there can be domination, there can be conflict, the way that I experience it in myself and that people have shared. So it's sometimes it is this feeling of I cannot be here, I don't want to be here, can arise, not always, but can arise from this part of us that doesn't really know how to integrate, but maybe is aware of this voice or the drive from this other part of us.
It's so fascinating that you say that, because my guides say that there's always two reasons that a soul embodies. One of them is purpose. One of them is like the divine mission, the service work. And the other one is pleasure. And if a lot of humans are only living with one of those currents running, and if you only live with one of those currents running, it is very, very destructive for your alignment, for your health, for your ability to be fully you. And I feel like obviously the biggest destruction of that is what you've just described, is literally the destruction of life, of your own life, of the body. And it makes me want to say, well, and we've come back to pleasure. We always go for a unexpected subject. We've come back to pleasure and the importance of pleasure. And so, obviously, a huge part of your work is pleasure, and particularly in the context of this conversation, I'd like to ask. So, if somebody is feeling disconnected from their pleasure, like they're too purpose-driven in themselves, maybe not at that suicidal point, but just their life is all purpose. You said that pleasure creates life force energy, and I'd really like you just to speak on that for somebody that's listening to this, being like, "Whoa, awakening! I need pleasure." And then, I remember when I, through my own trauma, did a load of purpose throughout my life, and didn't actually know what pleasure was. Didn't actually understand what pleasure was. So that's what I'd like you to speak on, if you don't mind. Is like, what is pleasure, and how do people cultivate it? Especially in order to create life force energy.
Thank you. There's one thing I feel to just share around the potential depression of not wanting to be here, or the potential thoughts or choice of suicide, which I think is one of the other important factors, which somehow feels important to mention, which I believe is another main driving cause, is the lack of expression and permission for the emotions. And so often people are unable to be with the pain of things from the past because they do not know how to, they've not got any permission to express them. There's a fear of expressing them. And so rather than, so often then they can develop destructive, and also I've had this close to me in my life, destructive habits like alcoholism, which then slowly, lead to destruction of the self. So there's a soul piece, and also in this world, there's like the stress, pressure, and the wounds and the pain, often of childhood, that we've not processed as adults, is another big issue for being, for being in that place where people feel like maybe they don't want to be here. And so, turning to pleasure. When I first offered this course on pleasure, it was 2016, which I think was the same year I met you, actually.
Was it?
It was, yeah. And I remember being cautious or aware that putting pleasure in the title of this retreat was going to make it tricky for people to come to it. Now, this wouldn't be true now, but back then there was barely nothing. There was nothing that was saying anything about pleasure. It was all about anger and grief and spiritual saving your soul, your shadow. Nobody was talking about pleasure, and and now there's like quite a lot of things, looking at it. So I realized it was risky because it was actually confronting people and asking them to own their desire for pleasure. And the first iteration of this was called Master Your Pleasure, because I wanted to be clear this is not about getting pleasure from someone else. And because most of the dysfunction and codependency around exchange of pleasure comes from, us trading with others and not understanding that actually pleasure comes only from within. Others can support. So firstly, pleasure is not something anyone can give to you or make you have. Pleasure is only something you can allow, to arise in your own body. And it also took me quite a while to convince people, and I have lots of stuff written on my website to try and explain, pleasure is not necessarily just hedonism. It is not necessarily selfish. We know these kind of the Puritan ideas around pleasure being sinful, selfish, not moral, not noble. So once we get through that layer, once we get through the layer of like shame, once we understand that pleasure is like a wide subject, so it's not just sexual pleasure. And the model I work with is based on 8 levels of human development. So actually the first pleasure is safety. and the first pleasure that we can experience as human being. And some of us experience that in the womb. And without that, we can't experience sexual pleasure to any great degree. And then the third level, there's many levels, but the third level is games and play and innocence. And this also relates to like what's our capacity for sexual pleasure and spiritual pleasure, which is the eighth. So firstly, when people talk about pleasure, I'm saying like pleasure is not just having good sex, which is what some people think you're talking about, or going on holiday or eating nice food. It's like, can you be safe in the body? Can you play? Can you have emotional pleasure? Can you have mental pleasure? What is sensual pleasure? What is sexual pleasure? And the other thing to know is that pleasure, I believe, is a medicine for the body. So there's now quite a lot of evidence, and neuroimmunobiology is a specialist field looking at what happens with pleasure in the body to your white cells, to your immune system is boosted, So not that we should need scientific evidence. It should be enough just to enjoy it. But if we do need scientific evidence to justify our pleasure, So that is there. It also creates happiness, and happiness is linked to quality of life and longevity and health. It does this thing of like filling up the battery, we were talking about energetically filling. So for me, pleasure creates and strengthens the life force, and also access to the life force gives greater access to pleasure. So there's kind of like a double filling loop there.
In a way, it's the opposite of that exchange pattern in those trauma patterns where you're like in that cycle of exchanging energy. This is like being in the cycle of receiving energy.
Yeah, and generating energy for yourself, but there's many things that are in the way of pleasure. And so when, and as you know, I spent 7 days working with pleasure, and then we're really just even touching the surface on people's patterns and their guilt and their resistance and their past body memories and the things that they're holding. So pleasure is physically good for you. It's good for your immune system. It's good for your mental health. I also see and experience pleasure as a prayer, as like something where we are, particularly if we're speaking about sexual energy, but it would be true for all, where can we take that sexual energy and where can we use that in a way? So in some of the more kind of sacred sexuality realms, they speak about sexual energy for multiple purposes. So for reproduction, recreation, which we know, but actually there are others. There's manifestation. So using sexual energy to manifest, which if this energy can create a life, what can it create if it's not creating a life? Rejuvenation, nurturing, rejuvenating the body, and restoration. So actually there are ways that if we run and we circulate sexual energy through our body ourselves or with others and we stay connected to it, then we are nurturing and refilling and refueling. And if I guide people in kind of like orgasmic type experiences, I usually say at the end, like if the red is like in your groin and is all your sexual energy and your breathing is spreading it throughout the body, imagining all this pink dye going, this sexual energy spreading and really nurturing these cells. Because if you're not putting that out there for creation of another human being, you can use this energy to bathe yourself in this life force. So sexual energy at a very high level gives access to altered states and gives access to journeying and gives access to downloads and gives access to intuition.
Cosmic orgasms.
Yes.
Well, on that note,
cosmic orgasms. That's what happens.
Yeah.
That feels like life force for sure.
Fiona says that feels like life force.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like and when Fiona was saying earlier about, keep it to yourself, if that's for you, your sexual energy around the kind of restriction and shame piece. Actually, even that is very shame, because one of the things I spent many years teaching is like mindful self-pleasuring, or, and looking at unhealthy masturbation habits, which actually also drain your energy. They don't fill your energy. If you're doing those as a form of stress relief or a form of avoidance or distraction, you're not really loving your body. You're just kind of like taking from your body in many ways and draining yourself. But if you can learn to, connect. But even that has been shamed. In fact, in the Catholic Church, they particularly like to shame self-touch or masturbation. So even if you're like trying to stay in the realms of your religious, cultural thing and not share your sexual energy with anyone else, which I wouldn't want to do myself, but say you wanted to do that, many of these religions and cultures also shame even self-connection to your own sexual energy. And the other thing, I think this is the last thing I want to say in sexual energy, is if 0 is disconnection and 10 is orgasm, like most of us are walking around with our engine of our sexual energy switched off.
Wow.
Because it's not appropriate, it's not welcome, we can't be walking around the office. Then we come to an engagement and we switch it on and it's there, and then we switch it off again. And so for me, one of the things working and helping people understand sexual energy and life force is the engine should always be on. You should always be connected. Doesn't mean you're walking around like super horny the whole time, unable to function. But your life force and your sexual energy should be running at a 2 or a 3. You should be connected to it and not shutting it on and off for some particular time. And because we are encouraged to shut it off when it's not appropriate, we're disconnected, from the life force. A lot of the time we're disconnected from our, like, that primary central channel.
And then also it's also like, anything to fire up, gear 1 in a car, like it costs a lot more energy to start something. So like every time you're having to turn yourself on and off, presumably you're wasting a load of energy. Whereas if you were just running it the whole very lightly, then you're not costing the energy that it takes to switch on and off, presumably.
Exactly. And actually we haven't even touched on the other big thing to do with life force and sexual energy, but life force in general is like the power of creativity that comes from that, and how that is connected to our creativity. So many people are disconnected from their creativity in life because this energy of sexual energy, that thread, if you like, of the life force channel that is sexual energy, is disconnected. And also, so if we've been kind of taught to build sexual energy and discharge it in a very kind of, get rid of it, peak orgasm kind of behavior. Whereas what if I build that sexual energy, I can hold it and I can take that into my life to use for creativity, to use for other purposes. But that's like a whole other area.
The conversation I would so love to have with you. I know that Fiona might not be able to speak.
I am completely disconnected from this conversation.
I feel like this conversation is like, I feel like it's had almost a demonstration of energy has been going on with the internet and the sound and everything.
I'm on the out.
Yeah.
I'm on the outside.
I know that Fiona would love to have you back when the technology is working and we can.
Can you hear me, Karila?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully in the recording you'll also hear Fiona. It's just me who's like, and I just had a look on my screen. Is there something I'm not doing? I was like, there's nothing on Fiona.
I don't know, but I do feel like, there's a force of Mother Earth in these conversations, and I do feel
and she didn't want me to have a voice.
But sexual energy and voice are also, like, to me, the voice is sexual energy. Like, the voice is part of our sexual energy. And I feel like, as we've been talking, the disconnect, whenever I talk about connection in my courses, disconnect can also come up, because it's just like, how can you talk about one without the other? And you know, the loss, if anything, I think pleasure, sexual energy, everything, the place where it can begin, especially if you're really traumatized, is with the reclaiming of your voice, because that is the reclaiming of your sexual energy. What I would love, Elaine, is that you come back when we can actually have Fiona in the conversation as well, because there's so many more things I want to ask you. There's so many more, like, I knew this was going to happen, that you were just going to open doors that I'm like, we need to go through that door and talk about creativity, and then we need to go through that trauma door, and like, there's so many places I want to go with you. So
Karila, I also want to reflect on the science and mystic connection as well.
Oh, and the science and the mystic connection is what Fiona wants to reflect on.
My logical brain needs that as well.
So we'd love to have you back. We haven't had any tech problems, so I don't know what's happened today, other than the fact that
the life force is strong.
Other than the fact that, like, as always, the field you hold and the space that you hold and the message that you have is so impactful that it's creating waves in the internet and the technology. And yeah, I really hope that you come back onto May the Life Force be with you, so that we can go deeper with some of these really important introduction conversations. I'm sorry about the technology. I have one more question for you. Who should we interview next?
Laurie Handlers, if she will say yes. She's busy, but she is a dear friend of mine, and she's sometimes up for doing. She would be great to talk about life force. She has more life force on a bad day than I could even have on a good day. Let me put it that way.
Wow.
I could connect you and see if she's up for a conversation.
Oh, that would be.
She is pretty full on schedule wise. Otherwise, I can think of some others. But as soon as you said it, that's what came to mind. And she actually has a radio show in the US called Sex and Happiness. And she's into radical life extension, and it's a huge amount of life force.
If you would connect us, we would be so grateful. I feel like her voice should definitely be part of the conversation. And like I said, I'm so sorry about this.
And I'm sorry not to hear more of your Scottish accent, Fiona, or to hear directly your questions. But yeah, thank you both. It's been one of the things I enjoy most actually about doing the conversations that I've done when I have time to do them. Is I'm really awful at recording anything or doing anything or finding time to do things. So it's one of the ways I find that I can also share with people, and then put most of the things that are on my website are all things that have come from like conversations and podcasts with people. So I'm also very grateful that you draw the conversation out and that we share that. And sometimes often I say things that I didn't even know I thought. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing you another time for sure.
Thanks, Elaine. Thank you. Okay, testing. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me, Karila?
I can hear you. Oh my God.
Thank goodness for that. I thought the universe was trying to disconnect me from the conversation. What was that tell? That told me a few things. It told me it's really hard when you're really interested in something and you're desperate to ask a question and can't. I felt like I was a school kid trying to put their hand up, me, in the front of the class. Because there was so many profound statements that Elaine said in her session that I was trying to kind of hook myself onto all these different, really interesting kind of directions we could go in. So I'm so grateful that she's coming back.
Yeah, I mean, she's so amazing. And, you know, I knew we would not get Elaine into the little slot that we had, but I felt for you, because in a way, though, it was such a demonstration of
disconnection of
of shame, of being overpowered, of like when your sexual energy is out of your body, like, you know, this thing of like, know yourself. And it's like, but if you can't hear yourself, if you can't speak for yourself, then how do you know yourself? So it felt like there was this like demonstration of what happens. And it through me and Elaine as well, you know, like we missed you. We wanted you part of that conversation.
So can I tell you the exact moment I think it went was when she was talking about the solar plexus, because I've been doing a lot of work on my solar plexus, and that is my blockage area. And she's saying, you know, your power is knowing yourself and knowing your own power. And I'd written down, everyone can have their own power. That is the one thing that you can own. And my mantra right now is I can, because it's connected to my solar plexus. And so the whole time I was thinking about that, I think that's when it went, and it was like, haha, no, you can't. Stop saying you can. I'm going to make sure you can't, just to play with you. Let's get playful with this, Fee. And I'm like, interesting. I actually can't. That's going to be really uncomfortable for me to sit with.
You can, and I don't.
Even my body language changed. I can feel it. I can feel it in myself, you know. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was so. It really showed me how much you bring to this conversation, because as soon as you were not able to be part of it, I felt unsafe.
Oh.
And, you know, what she was saying about safety being the first pleasure, it was like, Fiona brings safety to what is often a risky and dangerous and on the edge conversation. And that is one of your powers. And it's
thank you for saying that.
A good space holder. And so if a gift came out of this, I hope you know that to the people that you hold, you bring safety, which is the first pleasure, as Elaine so wisely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I was deep in my shame and my can't. So that, gosh, you know what? We learn something every time we do this from the most unexpected places. And this was technical issues, and gosh, I feel like I've kind of like need to go and lie down. I feel like, but strangely, my energy feels really high, but just feels like there was a lot to kind of absorb and take on there that might not have come across for people listening, but being in it and being in that space with Elaine, it'd be interesting to listen back to it actually, and how that felt with that in the moment disconnection versus it might sound like a beautiful journey on the other side, you know.
Maybe
we have our own perspectives. That's mine.
I mean, it that conversation had a lot of energy in it though, because I was feeling this energy coming, and I was like, I was really meeting the part of me that like could not hold this energy of this conversation, you know. Mighty. It was mighty.
It felt it. And
it went from porn to suicide to knowing yourself. I mean, like, it was vast.
Yeah, it was. Well, I'm glad we're going to get Chrissy back on again. And I'm just going to end with something that she mentioned, which I love, or a statement, a phrase that she used, and that was using pleasure as a prayer, or seeing pleasure as a prayer. And, you know, an invitation to take from that whatever that might mean to you.
Let's pray with all of our pleasure. The technology, thank God Elaine is free on Friday. The technology is gonna mean that you and her can pick up on the subject that I know you I know there was loads you want to speak about, but we're going to start with grief, and I pray that the technology is harmonious with that.
Thank you. So let's hope the life force is with us next time.
May the life force and the technology be with you.
Always.
We hope this conversation has topped up your life force energy. If it has, then please help us spread the life force. Like, share, subscribe, all of that. And may the life force be with all of us.